A Bit Lit, celebrating research and creativity of all kinds. Trevor, Carla, I'm absolutely delighted to see you both. Thank you so much for joining us today. We start our films by asking our contributors to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about their work and also about the project we're discussing. Trevor, perhaps if we start with you first, could you tell us who you are and what you do, please?
Thank you for having us, Andy. I'm Trevor Boffone. I'm based in Houston, Texas, and I'm primarily a Latinx theater scholar, but I also dabble in social media, youth studies, young adult literature. I'm sort of a one-man band, for better or for worse. Sometimes I love it, you know? And I also teach high school. So I'm in my high school classroom right now. And I also, teach part-time at the University of Houston. Yeah, that's me.
Perfect, thank you. And I should say, in order to make this film, you two have very kindly agreed to talk sense and talk work very early in your day. So thank you very much for that. We're battling through with time differences.
Early bird gets the worm, right?
Yes, exactly. Carla, how about yourself?
I'm Carla Della Gatta. I'm an assistant professor of English at Florida State University. So I'm currently in Tallahassee, Florida. And my primary research and teaching fields are Shakespeare, Latinx theater, and LGBTQ theater. So I teach kind of across two different time periods, and this work comes out of kind of a long-term project of talking about Latinx themed Shakespeare productions. And Trevor and I met actually through our work in the Latinx Theater Commons 6 years ago or something like that. And so we were brought together through that type of work, and it's been a great joy to work on this with him.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to hear more about that collaboration, because I'm always fascinated to kind of hear the behind the scenes work that's happened, as well as the public thing that we're celebrating. So do share anything you feel comfortable sharing, but maybe can you tell us what the it is, the this of the thing that you've been doing?
So we have a book that was published on June 30th. Called Shakespeare and Latinidad with Edinburgh University Press. And it's a collection of 25, 24, 26. Carla might know the right number. It's a lot of essays that are scholarly essays. There's also practitioner essays and interviews that look at this phenomenon of Latinx theater in the United States that is Shakespeare themed or is riffing off of Shakespeare, remixing Shakespeare. And so that's why we're here today.
Yeah, great. Congratulations on the book. I always say that I never do live math. I never try and count something live. But so well done for being brave and working out how many chapters there are.
There's a lot. There's something for everyone, right?
I mean, that immediately raises questions about the kind of form of the book. You can tell me, but it sounds like these might be shorter form essays, but trying to get more voices in. I'm kind of interested in that in itself. Like, there's a kind of inclusive decision there, just at the level of how many essays to have.
Yes, we have some kind of standard length, longer essays from scholars and so forth. But what we really wanted to do in this burgeoning field is make it democratic. And so we have 25 contributors, and we have shorter essays that are 2,500 words and longer ones. We have a few dialogues as well with some actors and directors who are in conversation with each other. And about 2/3 of our contributors are university faculty, but a lot of them have MFAs and they are scholar practitioners. And so we've really divided up the book. We have two different roadmaps for the readers, one kind of going in the order in which it's structured, parts 1 through 4, but then also if people are interested in acting, there are actors who've written essays and actors in dialogue, as well as directors and vocal coaches, as well as scholarship. So there are kind of two different ways that the book can be read, and hopefully there are shorter and longer essays that can serve different purposes, again, a classroom or for theater practitioners and scholars too.
Oh, it sounds so great. And I could spend the entire film talking about the kind of form of the book, but I'm not going to do that. We can come back to that. But I feel like firstly, just for our audience's benefit, we should just unpack a little bit of the content of this book. I'm already wondering if Latinx will be a familiar term to absolutely everyone watching this film, and if we might think about that. And then just to think about Latinx theatre and Shakespeare together. I'll leave it to you to decide where we go there, but could you tell us a bit more?
Carla, do you want to take Latinx and then I'll jump into the book origins?
Sure. So Latinx, according to the American government, and I say that starting with that in that way for a reason. According to the American government, there are 4 races: white, Caucasian, Black or African American, Indigenous, Native American, and Asian. And then as for ethnicity, it's on our census as Hispanic/Latino. And in MENA, Middle Eastern North African, has gained a lot of traction and so forth, but I don't think it was officially on the census. So people who are Latino, who are the people of the Americas who have typically a shared geographic and political history. Hispanic also includes Spain and is more of a term that's based on language of countries that have Spanish as a dominant language. So there is a lot of overlap, but Latino is more commonly used. So the people who identify as Latino can be of any race. I think more than 75% of people who identify as Latino are racially white, but there are people who are mixed races and so forth. And over 18% of the population of the United States is Latinx. And so this term Latino, as we know, Spanish is a gendered language. So for more equality, it was Latina/O, and then it went to Latin, or some other forms, but then Latinx. So the X is there to mean there's no gender. Gender is not a binary. Some people take issue with the X now. It can be pronounced Latinx or Latinx. I prefer Latinx because it keeps the Spanish sound of Latino, and Latinx sounds a little racy, so now some people are saying Latine ending with an E. So you'll hear a bunch of these terms, but this type of language play is germane to Latinidad. Latinidad means Latinity or Latinus, right, in the present tense. And that type of language play I've always associated with Shakespeare as well. Like this kind of complexity, it's changing, and it can be a lot of fun and sometimes also challenging, right? So that's the term that we're using, and we're referring to people who are within the United States or currently live in what's the geographic boundaries of the United States versus Latin America.
That was a brilliant account. Thank you.
Fast forward a bit, and I was in Texas. I'm in Texas, but a group of scholars in Texas, theater scholars, literature scholars, we were putting together a symposium on Latinx Shakespeare's, and specifically ways that Shakespeare was intersecting with theater in the borderlands, in Texas, and with Latinx population. From the very, very beginning, we're like, who's our keynote? And everyone said, Carla Della Gatta. Like, it was not even a question, like we had to have Carla. I guess that was 2018, yeah. In April, it was a one-day thing. It was really, really great. And there was clearly a lot of work being done in the field, right? Both scholarly work and also artistic work. And from that moment, this book kind of was born. This field of Latinx Shakespeare has really blown up and exploded in the last, 3 years since we started the project. We kind of deliberately moved slowly because of that, because we didn't want to put the book out too soon, right? We wanted the conversations to actually be able to emerge. And so now, we're seeing this intersection happening all over the place all the time.
When I started my graduate program in 2010, I think my original, as the way scholarly topics develop, I think my original intention was to write about American Shakespeare festivals and what they mean to minority cultures, in plural. And I had met Ayanna Thompson, and I knew of her work and talking about race on stage. And there's a lot of work by a number of scholars on Black bodies on stage and Blackness in the text. Alexa Wang had just published Chinese Shakespeare's. I'm like, oh, where's the stuff on Latinos? And there wasn't anything. I thought I would grab all 3 of these pieces and put them together and try to make an intervention in contemporary theater. And there wasn't anything. And the questions I got in the pushback were, do Latinos do Shakespeare? I'm like, of course they do. And I think when I pitched the project as a graduate student, I had found, to use Columbusing terms, 7 productions, and I was grasping, and I really was. By the time I finished the dissertation—
What year was that, Carla?
2011. And some of that has to do with searching, knowing what to ask, knowing who to find, and some of it had to do with simply not a lot going on. And then the Latinx Theater Commons forms in 2013. Actually, the straw that broke the camel's back was a problematic Latinx themed Shakespeare production that started that. I started circulating and realizing what's going on. When I finished the dissertation, I had tracked over 40 productions. And then things just started to kind of hit a certain stride. A playwright and activist named Luis Alfaro, who was my colleague at my last institution, a MacArthur genius, was named the first playwright in residence at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, which is the United States' largest repertory theater. And with that, Trevor and I also met up too with the Latinx Playwrights Project that was held at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where I had been going for years as a Shakespearean. And then I was there with my Latinx theater colleagues, and that, like, what was happening? I didn't, and so these worlds kind of started to collide as I had been working on it, as other people started working on it. And so that's kind of where we are. At this point, I have a monograph specifically on Latinx Shakespeares that will be out in 2022. And I have tracked over 130 Latinx themed Shakespeare productions, and most of which have occurred in the last 20 years. But now I can really historicize them back to 1969 and some antecedents before then. So kind of with the formation of this conception of an ethnic category of Hispanic and Latino. So that's kind of where it's coming from. But even as Trevor and I have been working on this, more people are producing this art. And so that's really helpful, but it also changes the way that we theorize it and are able to understand it.
And that's where I'd like to go next, I think, is the practice-based nature of your work in the book and this project. Before I do that, if it's all right, just to linger with a tantalizing detail that Carla gave us from your work more generally, Carla, and it sounds like we should get you back next year to celebrate your monograph.
Oh, yeah.
But if you went from having this kind of relative paucity of productions to work with early on in the project, but you now have 130 going all the way back to 1969, I wonder if the recent explosion in productions, has that made it easier to research historical productions? Has it kind of developed a language which makes it easier to go back to the archive and back to the historical record?
Actually, what's been more helpful is that a lot of theaters have been scanning in old information. There were productions that I looked up in 2012 that I was contacting people and so forth. Now people have uploaded old programs. I've actually purchased a lot of ephemera on eBay. Strangely, periodically I'll take 2 hours, watch an old movie and query a whole bunch of things. But yes, the way what I'm querying for, as well as a network of people who I'm in touch with, where it becomes complicated is the idea, the label of Hispanic/Latino was coming into formation. So for example, Paul Robeson, the first African-American to play Othello with a white cast on a Broadway stage, then you see this picture of Robeson down, like kneeling, and his Iago is standing behind him looking threatening. And so what everyone talks about is there's an African-American actor playing Othello, which nowadays wouldn't actually get much commentary. But what isn't talked about is his Iago is Jose Ferrar, who's Puerto Rican. And we would now talk about a Latino Iago, but he was considered simply to be white. He becomes the first Latino to win an Academy Award for acting, which he does for Cyrano de Bergerac, and the second is actually Rita Moreno, who's also Puerto Rican, for West Side Story. But he was just considered to be white, and all of the stereotypes that are applied to Latinx actors today and problematic tropes were not applied to him because the ethnic category had not yet been cohered. So where historicizing Latinidad can be problematic for that reason.
Yeah, and that's what Brian Herrera talks about in Latin numbers, stealth Latino performers, like Ricardo Montalban and Ferrer. Something that this reminds me of, Carla, is, do you think, I find in Latinx theater there is, as we're starting to, the first generation of Latinx theater makers are now in their 70s, 80s, and people are starting to pass on, right? And so I find there is this momentum to archive things, right? And to collect oral histories and to recover what's been lost, right? And so we're starting to find out, just like Carla was saying, about these productions that happened that just weren't recorded, right? No one reviewed them, no one wrote about them, the scripts weren't published, right? The websites didn't exist. And so it's kind of an exciting time if you're a researcher in this field, to really be able to work alongside these artists to tell these stories.
Right. And one of the things that Trevor, I mean, and in Latinx theater, that one of the challenges and exciting opportunities too is that so much happens in a festival context. And I don't mean festival, long-standing theater that has the word festival in its name, but there are a lot of kind of fleeting, not just fleeting productions, but fleeting venues for those productions. Yeah. And so Trevor's work really picks up when it comes to music and dance and other aspects of that type of theater as well. And so where it kind of marries up is these kind of interdisciplinary topics, right, that we're both kind of branching out in different ways.
Perfect. So theatre happens not in conventional theatre buildings, but out on the street, in festivals. Yeah, wonderful. Like I say, that kind of brings us to where I'd like to go next, which is the practice-based nature of your work, and also the way that this book has brought into conversation scholars and creative practitioners. I kind of just want to ask a really general question, so you can take it wherever you want to go. So in a way, I'm just going to say, scholars, creative practitioners, tell me more. But yeah, could you tell us something about what it means to bring those two worlds together, and what the result has been?
Well, I will say this: there historically, in the U.S. at least, there has been this divide between scholars and artists, right? For whatever reason, right? Artists maybe don't trust scholars because maybe scholars have had shady ethical practices in the past. You know, there's always reasons behind this. When the Latinx Theater Commons was formed in 2013, one of the pillars of the LTC has been scholarship, right? And scholars have been present from the beginning, right? And that was very intentional to create these relationships that could then lead to documentation, books like our book, so on and so forth. And so at least in that circle, and I see the same thing happening in African-American theater in the US, and MENA, and all these different, marginalized communities where there's really a conversation happening in a way that might not have been happening 20 years ago between scholars and artists. And so the other thing I'll say is that a lot of, even the people in our book who are writing a more practitioner-based essay, they're still scholars, right? A lot of people are artist scholars. They wear multiple hats. And so I think, what we've done has been try to honor that conversation and to honor this, a lot of people think if you're not a PhD, it's not scholarship or you're not a scholar. And I think Carla and I both really reject that, right? There are brilliant people who have MFAs who can produce, cutting edge scholarship. And we hope that our book, succeeds in that endeavor. But I don't know if Carla, you want to add to that?
Well, yeah. And Trevor also is a co-editor on two different books that are archiving a very important Latinx theater festivals, one in 2014 and one in 2017. So, I'm
the festival person. I didn't realize that.
Yes, yeah, you're the festival person. But yes, on this aspect in a way of understanding art making, and I always use the term art very broadly in the sense that theater, film, device theater, whatever it might be. But in that the act, I think Trevor and I are both certainly in agreement with this idea that it's not just scholars taking a theoretical lens and applying it to some art, that we understand the practice of art making as critical inquiry in itself, right? Yeah. That in order to adapt, that is a critical approach, and that there is that when people make art, when you engage this type of work, that it is scholarly practice, and in a way that our society doesn't value, it doesn't get the same label. And so understanding it in that way, it wasn't like, oh, how many practitioners do we have versus scholars? We never had a conversation like that. And some of the playwrights who wrote for us, Octavio Solis on translation, same with Magdalia Cruz, an actor named Frankie J. Alvarez, who was on Looking, he played Hamlet, Prince of Cuba. He's the first person to play Hamlet in the United States at any major theater. As a Latino or Latin American. There have been other Latinx actors to do so, but he was the first one to play him. And so he's writing about acting in different languages and what that means to his performance. And he has an MFA from Juilliard, and his essay is just as scholarly as an academic and theorized as many other kind of scholarly essays that I've read. So yeah.
Brilliant. I keep meaning to ask you both, MFA means?
Oh, Master of Fine Arts. So typically the people in our book have that degree in playwriting or directing and acting.
Yeah.
And it's a terminal degree. So
oh yeah, it's a terminal degree. Yeah. You write a
To my ears, that
thesis.
sounds like a degree you get and then someone kills you.
Yeah,
What is a
it-
terminal degree?
I think what kills you is student loan debt. So yeah, this is the
We laugh
US.
at that.
You know.
right. No, it just means you wouldn't earn a PhD afterwards. So
Thank you. I mean, this is very dear to a bit that the project we're speaking on now, which has tried to bring together practitioners and scholars. And I'm always excited to hear about what I think you're telling me is, you know, the co-creation of art and knowledge, and particularly knowledge which remaps, you know, the ways in which knowledge has been used and abused in the past to favor non-marginalized communities. Communities are being centered by the ways we've told historical and contemporary facts and stories. So I'm really interested in that. I kind of want to point our listeners to a couple of other films in case they want to follow up on any of this. So the Tide Project, run by Nandini Das, which is on the history of immigration in early modern England, worked with creative practitioners as well. So if people want to follow up on this, there's a film there. And Carla also talked about casting decisions around Othello, and we made a film with Miles Greer, who is very convinced that that play has been written for white actors and should not be touched by black actors, is essentially what he ends up arguing in the film. So if anyone wants to follow up on any of these ideas, those would be places to go. Do you mind telling us some sort of kind of big headlines coming out of the book then? So you've got these 25 contributions, which already feels like, therefore, you're going to have a lot of stuff in the book as editors to make decisions about, you know, do we want those things to end up speaking to each other, or actually are we quite excited if they don't? I'm thinking about books I've edited in the past where I have to kind of make that decision about pulling things together or letting them sit in different places. But do you feel there are kind of headline stories, ideas coming out of the book that we might hear about now and will tempt listeners to the book? Carla, maybe we start with you.
Yeah. I have ideas, but yeah.
Yes. Well, part of what I also want to, you know, what this association of Shakespeare and Latinidad, like why them together? It's not just, yes, Latinx people also do Shakespeare, of course, and more so, but also when it comes to this intersection, it always involves some level of translation or language play. Even if Spanish is used in a minor way, indigenous languages, other languages, there's always some modification, right? And so what does it mean to take a group of people, because Latinx people as an ethnic construct did not exist in the early modern period. Shakespeare doesn't write of any Latinos. There's one mention of Mexico in The Merchant of Venice, but it's not a recovery project. It's not about misrepresentation in the Shakespearean canon. It's about a group of people. What does cultural translation mean when that culture as a concept didn't exist in the literature that we're talking about? So we have people who are talking about playing Shakespeare as Latinx, and we have people who are like, I'm Latinx and I've done Shakespeare, and what all of the challenges, assumptions, diegetically, right, in translation, acting methods that involve Shakespeare in English when people's first language is Spanish, or when actors are asked to act in Spanish, they're like, I'm bilingual, but I've never gone through actor training in Spanish, right? And all of these kind of minor and kind of finer things, right? So we're talking a lot about bilingual and semi-bilingual theater, as well as acts of translation, whether they're literary translation or cultural translation. So I didn't answer your question in a cohesive way, but Trevor can speak more to the organization of the book. But those are all like the things that we're grasping.
But absolutely, and I mean so there's 4 sections of the book. They're roughly even, and the first 3 sections look at like translation, adaptation, dramaturgy. I don't know why I can't remember the third, but basically what Carla just explained. And the 4th section, which is my favorite section, not just because I'm in that section, is about the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and specifically the work happening in Ashland, Oregon. And for those that are not familiar with Ashland, Oregon, it is a rural town in Southwest Oregon with a very low Latinx population. Oregon as a state is not necessarily known as a place with a high Latinx population either, but this is a place where the work has really been concentrated in the last, 10, less than 10 years, I'd say, for a number of reasons. And so we look at how all of these themes emerge in this one rural location, because a lot of times when we talk about Latinx peoples in the US, we're talking about Florida, Texas, California, New York, Chicago. We're looking at these urban centers, right? I mean, not we in this conversation, but people tend to associate Latinos with major cities, right? And so what does it mean when this intervention is happening in a place that is not a big city? It's a rural place. It is a place that is hard to get to. You know, you have to fly to Seattle or Portland or San Francisco, then get on a small plane, go to Medford, then you get on a bus or like a cab or some sort of something, and you drive 20, 30 minutes. And so it's a remote place, right? But this is a place that, you know, is a major regional theater that, when did Bill Rausch take over? Like 2008?
Yeah.
So, and when he came in, he brought in Carmen Morgan, who runs Art Equity, right? And they did extensive equity, diversity, inclusion training with all of their staff. And so really, they radically changed the DNA of this theater company, OSF. And as a result, you started to see these really inclusive programming start to happen, and really putting money into the community and putting money into supporting Latinx theater. And it really, the conversation emerged with Shakespeare, alongside, right? And so that section of the book looks at the Play On Festival, Play On Shakespeare, which is now its own, nonprofit theater that had every Shakespeare play translated into contemporary English by different playwrights. And there were 8 Latinx playwrights who did that. So I write about that. And then Migdalia Cruz, Octavio Solis write about their translation processes. We have actors who talk about, what this looks like in Oregon, so on and so forth. So, there's a lot of conversations happening. And just like we've said, I know we're beating it over the head. There's really something for everyone. And I think, honestly, the work is accessible. We wanted it to be accessible to students, to theater makers, right? So we see this as a critical, a dramaturgical intervention, right? For anyone looking to produce culturally relevant Shakespeare, whether it's Latinx or not, I think there's something of value there.
Right, and sorry, one thing I'll add on, is that an echo? One thing I'll add on to that is the last section is this kind of case study of OSF, but throughout the book, we're talking about productions, the authors are talking about productions in Latinx theaters in Portland, in a university production in California, to a fully Spanish language production in Miami, in a community theater. And so they range, it's not just kind of the places that you think would be mentioned, right? As well as the Public Theater in New York and the Goodman, like kind of these established theaters as well.
But it's actually a shockingly low, we thought about this because there was this assumption we saw earlier this year about Latinx theater is in cities, Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago. And so then we went back through our chapters and we're like, where is everything taking place? And our book is very shockingly not LA, not New York, not Chicago focused. It's there, but it's not, this conversation is happening across the country, even in places where you would really not expect it to happen, like Oregon.
Yeah, it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I guess my kind of final question with this is just to think a bit more about Latinx plus Shakespeare and what that gives us. And Carla's point that there isn't a lot of Latinx to be found in Shakespeare's text per se is really important. But I also wonder if some of the work you're doing is kind of undoing something that was happening in Shakespeare's lifetime, which was sort of institutionalizing theatre in an urban space which dominates the wider country. Shakespeare himself is someone who leaves a small rural setting and goes to the heart of the metropolis. And theatre is moving away from being festival-based and connected to particular moments in the calendar year, and is becoming kind of proto-capitalist, building-based. And it's not all of those things. It's still touring, and in fact, it's touring internationally. But I wonder if Shakespeare's sort of at the beginning of a process which Latinx plus Shakespeare is now helping to undo. That might be super banal and just straightforwardly incorrect. I'm just kind of throwing that at you to see what comes back.
Well, I mean, there in this, well, there are a number of ways of looking at that. No, I think it's a wonderful proposal, right? You know, and a premise for how does this kind of mirror or engage with theater making in the early modern period, because some of that does have to do with the creativity and the what are the rules, right? You know, and when it comes to representation, there's a lot of conversation about authenticity, anachronism, you know, and what are the ethics of representation as well. And so there are divergent viewpoints within the Latinx theater community of why are we doing Shakespeare? We need to tell our own stories. But there are Latinx playwrights and practitioners who have adapted Moliere, Chekhov, certainly the Spanish Golden Age playwrights, a whole bunch of Lorca.
Greek theater.
Yeah, Greek theater, absolutely. And so some people, it's not Latinx as an identity, and here's the take on what Shakespeare means. There's a whole bunch of different types of engagement of, he's a good playwright, why not, right? It may have to do with generation, it has to do with language, but also where stories, what certain elements kind of seem to fall into place with Latinx culture. Some of my work is about this idea of fatalism or fatalismo, like from Octavio Paz's work, right? And how this romantic idea of dying for love that really kind of blends into Romeo and Julietas, right? And it kind of works in that way. And so there are certain thematic strings that can come out, as well as, and when it comes to the comedy of errors and issues of immigration, same with Twelfth Night. Some of them are kind of politically apt of the moment, but also there are just some beautiful speeches that people are like, I want to, this is how I was trained. Of course, I want to engage with it. So it's not always about this opposition and representation and a political stance. Sometimes it's just people making art.
Great. Trevor, any
No,
thoughts?
I have nothing to add to that.
Yeah, I don't blame you. That was brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. It sounds like a really wonderful book. I love Trevor's idea that this will be of value to anyone looking to make culturally relevant Shakespeare. I'm working at the moment on a production of a non-Shakespearean early modern play, working with queer, transgender, and disabled performers. And I can already see how much value your own work will be as we start to have those conversations. So, just selfishly, I'm excited to have this conversation. And I know that so many people watching and listening will be getting the same value. We end our films by asking what the word literature means to you. And you're welcome to answer this as professionally or as personally as you like. And you're welcome to answer it from your own point of view or from the point of view of the other people you've been engaging with in this book, what the term literature might mean kind of more generally in a Latinx plus Shakespeare context. Maybe if we start with Trevor this time.
Okay, so to me, literature, and I think this is where Carla and I have found success as a co-editorship, is it's living and it's breathing. And for us, it's really rooted in performance. So, we early on both agreed that our book was about performance and theater and not necessarily dramatic literature. But of course, literature is part of that conversation. And so for me, it's something that involves real people. It involves, living, breathing people on a stage, performing. And that really gives that embodiment, right? Leads to that conversation about representation and inclusivity and social change and all of these different things. Because as we know, I believe being in co-presence with an audience in front of living, breathing people can really, ignite a different kind of conversation than say something strictly on the page can.
Thank you. If it's okay to ask a follow-up question, Trevor, I'm fascinated by that because I agree entirely. I also wonder how that intersects with your work on things like TikTok and internet cultures where, the living and breathing, we've all lived through a year of exactly that being suddenly very difficult. Do you mind telling us a bit about how those connect for you or don't connect?
I think it connects in a very different way. I think social media, specifically TikTok and Dub Smash, has the same potential, but it's linking people in a digital space. So I write about, say, how different social media apps can bring people together by replicating trends. So Andy might create a dance trend to, I don't know, the Scissor Sisters, I don't know. And then, I don't know why that was the one I said.
That's how I'm going to end this film. I've planned my routine. That's how this film is going to end.
Done. And then I replicate it. So then I'm in dialogue with you. I'm mimicking your body. I'm mimicking your movements. And then Carla comes in and she creates her own different spin on it, right? Who are these two dudes? I'm gonna show them. And so us all being in conversation, doing the same dance, the same trend, creates this community. It creates this culture that then will leave, say, Zoom or TikTok, and the conversation happens in a similar way, but a very different way. I'm not sure if I answered that. I don't want to take too much time.
No, that's brilliant. Those of you watching this film, do rush to TikTok after watching this so you can see our 3 dances. And
there you go.
Carla, it feels like a long time ago now, but the question was, and it's my fault, by the way, but the question was what literature is, what it means to you, or to, from the point of view of your own, of the work.
Well, I majored, my undergraduate degrees, I have 2 degrees in English and 2 in theater. And I had a wonderful undergraduate education, but we focused, I felt, so much on dramatic literature that we didn't get enough theater history and understanding of historical theatrical practice. It was a long time ago, so there's been a lot of research done since then. So I'm like, oh, it was before that stuff was, anyway. So, but I felt as if I had missed out by not having that education in my, to me, it felt like it damaged it impeded my understanding of the dramatic literature, which is why I switched disciplines for my PhD into a theater program. And so I don't teach dramatic literature without some type of theater history, theater practice, performance theory along with it, because you're only getting part of it. But where Trevor and I also meet up in our other interests, like Kids Through Dance and TikTok, and my work with bilingual and Spanish theater and so forth, it has to do with orality and the sound of poetry and of literature and so forth, that reading it aloud in any tradition, but that it becomes incredibly important and you learn something from that. So where musicality, rhythm, sound, noise, silences are incredibly important, code switching, linguistic, going back and forth between languages, all this stuff is kind of central to Latinx Shakespeare's, but also to Shakespeare and to Trevor's work when it comes to dance and music and so forth. So I think for me, it's the oral frame of the theater, and where the visual gets so much importance, right? Of course, it's theater, you go and you watch it, but the auditory is where I think we're both ramping up what that means. And Latinx Shakespeare's is the place where it becomes all the more heightened, right? Because when you can you identify a Latinx character and person on the stage? Sometimes, depending on what that means to your ideas about what that appearance should mean. But oftentimes, ethnicity is conveyed through the oral, through accent and language and so forth. And so that's where I think we really found this project to be incredibly productive for in itself, but also for Shakespeare studies and Latinx theater.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And that's been a real through story of everything you've said in this film, really, that kind of really interesting tension or combination of authenticity and representation and the right to claim an identity, but on the other hand, also to have the right just to play across various identities and to be allowed just to be an artist and a creative. I think that's incredibly exciting. I can't wait to read the book. Congratulations to both of you. And thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having us.
Take care.